All right, so welcome to, I believe we're at week 75 or 76 of the Coronavirus Multi-Species Reading Group sessions. So 75 or 76 straight weeks of talking to amazing thinkers and scholars together. And today we're joined by Charne Lavery, and who's going to be talking to us about a new paper, a new manuscript. Non-circulating, very exciting. And the title is The Only Almost Germ-Free Continent Left, Pandemics, Impurity, and Cultural Perceptions of Antarctica. So thanks so much for joining us. And I really want to also say thank you to Melanie for being the bridge and putting us together for this session. And so today we're going to say, hey, Frederic, welcome. We are going to be talking about the polar epidemic tradition with Charne. And, I was left, thinking a lot about the, kind of historical and speculative apocalyptic narratives that, tend to reveal an awful lot about fears about social hierarchies, fears about social, societal collapse. And many of these themes that you and your co-authors are analyzing for today, I think really resonate with our global pandemic now, even those earlier pieces from, turn of the century pieces that you're analyzing in a lot of ways, especially what you've written about, you call, quote, the politics of not only what, but also who belongs in Antarctica. So I wonder if you could first just give us a little bit of a broader context of your work. Maybe tell us about your broader work in the oceanic humanities. Just to start, I understand that you're on an international scientific committee for Antarctic research. Tell us a little bit about some of these ongoing research interests that are related to this very particular place, and let's dive right into your piece.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. It's I must say that I also found your brief synopsis of what the paper was about advertised to the group one of the best and most useful descriptions of what the paper was trying to do. So I really appreciate the kind of generosity of, in some ways, mostly people just use your own abstract and then you're stuck in the same position, but this was a really helpful summation of what it can mean. So my work is my primary work is in a research group called the Oceanic Humanities for the Global South. And it's really just a more specific version of the environmental humanities focused on oceans, primarily for two kind of reasons. One is with this sense, because we work in the humanities, the sense of the I guess the most imaginatively resonant signifier of climate change is a rising sea. But also because of the history, kind of intellectual history of the people I'm working with at WITS, which was being interested in Indian Ocean histories and imaginaries, and the ways in which they complicated a kind of land-based, static African sensibility that was and with the only relationship being in kind of opposition to the north and Europe, with these kind of that set of kind of Orientalist and there's a couple of scholars who've talked about Africanist as kind of even the more extreme version, set of like inversions. And was looking much more towards the Indian Ocean as a space of long south-south mobility, India, Africa, Arab world connections over a very long period of time. That this is a continent not just for being explored, but for exploration, with diasporas across the Indian Ocean as much as across the Atlantic. So my work was in literary studies, so in post-colonial fiction that takes its focus not so much kind of like the national allegory, but on this other wider terrain, which has a sort of I guess wider moral ambit as well, and then inevitably, perhaps in this time, my interest became also in the so that's really the ocean as a connecting socio-political space. My interest became then in looking at the ocean as an environmental space as well, partly because the monsoon, which underpins all of these trade and travel, is totally changing in a time of climate change. I wanted to know how that affected the deeper layers of the ocean, as well as the parts of the ocean that are more relevant to South Africa when I moved back here. So the southern parts of the Indian Ocean, which are beyond the reach of the monsoon. And that kind of going deeper and going further south kept going until I hit Antarctica. And the reason for that is really that, the southern Indian Ocean connects to the Southern Ocean, connects to the Antarctica, and also that a lot of the monsoonal changes are linked to melting ice in the Antarctic region. And I just became really interested in the absence of any imaginative links from certainly the African continent with Antarctica. And based on that work in generally Southern Ocean work, from the Southern Indian Ocean to the Southern Ocean to Antarctica, there just weren't that many people working on humanities scholarship. So now I'm this representative to the South African National Committee for Antarctic Research in the Humanities. And it's been kind of weirdly, oddly fascinating and motivating, I think.
Thanks, Charne. This is so interesting to hear you, use the word, static in thinking about versus say mobility with water. So I hope that we can actually swing back to that later. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the narratives that you and your co-authors actually decided to ultimately select and closely analyze. I mean, there's such a range of narratives and themes, and I found them quite fascinating in terms of their historic breadth as well. So I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about the narratives that you ended up selecting to analyze, why you went with this. How did you, tell us a bit about that kind of archival process.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it starts, the paper really started off with a couple of the articles that I mentioned about a third of the way in, which we were sharing among, Ellie Lean wrote the primary book about literature in Antarctica. It's Antarctica in fiction, and has done the most extensive work on what are all the narratives about Antarctica that are fictional, and as well as that sort of heroic era life writing canon. And what's interesting about Ellie's work is that there is a kind of, in terms of literature in English in particular, there is an established canon. That, there isn't an unlimited amount of writing on Antarctica. So it's possible to then, with Ellie's help, to trawl that fiction for all of basically the, one of the things she noticed in her book prior to this, and it's one of the chapters well before COVID, was that a key narrative about Antarctica is actually very similar to, I've looked at literature on islands, and it's similarly, the ways in which islands both protect and trap. So that notion of you can be trapped on an island, but it can also protect you by this kind of moat of the ocean. Focus on something like The Thing was relevant because and this is where the article started, is we were all sharing among ourselves that really what seemed to be a profusion of articles about Antarctica in the early days of the pandemic. I hadn't noticed so many newspaper articles, magazine articles, think pieces, videos about Antarctica, and there just seemed to be many more of them at that time. We actually have a companion research group. So this is all part of a wider project in which people have looked at much more sociological studies of what the pandemic has done to research bases and protocols in Antarctic science. and our team is on cultural representations of Antarctica, and one of the other teams has actually done the media analysis about, was there a spike in mentions and what is the characteristics of that spike? And they did find that it was, and it's really for two reasons. One was the same as, you know, all the astronauts became really popular because everyone wanted those who had experience with isolation to share, you know, it was like looking for models of isolation, but also this notion of, you know, that Antarctica is the giant freezer and therefore somehow quite sterile and safe. So we did do a very wide range of texts, and it's one of the things that was a bit tricky to put together, as you can possibly tell from the paper. We wanted to do a kind of 20th century focus, that all of the key texts, if you look at Antarctic literature in general, is kind of summarized by Ellie's book. Many of them do have references to viruses, contagion, and this kind of really quite obsessional notion of the continent as pure. So we did a very kind of, where are the most obvious references to these ideas, particularly in the first half of the paper. And in the second half of the paper, we try to hone in on books or narratives, like particularly Spire was the one. I just kind of couldn't help but include it because it was so very precisely published just before the pandemic, and then about, you know, viral contagion and Antarctica. So it was much more kind of doing a close reading rather. So I guess the paper is a mix of literary methodologies for typical literature papers, literary critical papers, which is, one is taking a literary history and looking at the kind of survey of what has been said on this topic, and the other one is doing a more close reading into how these metaphors and narratives work in particular texts.
And Melanie and Frederick, feel free to jump in whenever you like. You know, as a waste scholar, was super fascinated with these kind of tensions of the themes of purity, and also at the same time kind of sterility, or this conversation about Antarctica as a laboratory. I you know, as I was going through my notes earlier, I was thinking, yeah, those, you know, I couldn't help but think about the kind of cultivation of, or the generation of, you know, germ-free mice for microbiome research and that kind of thing. So I'm just so fascinated by these tensions that you're picking up on in the narratives. And I, you know, wonder if you could say a little bit more about those. You write about, you kind of pick up on a theme of purity rituals, which are not a thing of fiction. You know, you're thinking about kind of these ideas about maintenance of purity, or of wild and wilderness. So just tell us a little bit more about these two particular themes.
Yeah, the notion of waste is really interesting, and in some ways, both waste and melting seemed very defrosting. You know, it seemed very interesting. We weren't quite sure how to build it, in particular and maybe it was quite relevant for South Africa, but in the beginning there was a concern with the vaccines, that they needed to be kept at Antarctic temperatures, and you know, if they defrosted, they would become unusable. But that just seemed to have some bearing on this notion of a kind of defrosting and therefore depurifying Antarctica. So the thing that I've been wondering about elsewhere in my work, and I have thought quite a lot about Tim Clark and a number of other environmental scholars, eco-critics have talked about the way in which our language is structured around notions of inside and outside. And so outside is somewhere you can put waste. So, you know, I can throw this away. Where is away? There is, you know, no such place really. Like, it's always just out of sight rather than out of existence. So that, trying to refigure a kind of way of speaking that doesn't presume an outside space, and so like an externalities are somehow built in here in ways I don't fully comprehend. But certainly the deep ocean has long been figured as that. Ellie's other work on nuclear waste was often, and nuclear-free zones, Antarctica and the deep sea are both now nuclear weapon-free zones. But partly because they were both figured as places that could be used to dispose of nuclear waste, because they're nowhere, they're outside. Part of the paper was to show the ways in which that isn't true, that there's actually quite a lot of tourism, there's a lot of impact on Antarctica. It's not so much outside, and even if it's far away, plastics are turning up in penguins right at the pole. So it's to push a little bit back against the notion that there is such a thing as waste that can be got rid of by and the imaginary of space as somewhere that is possible to do that. The mention of microbiome I find particularly interesting, because this is the what I was mentioning is the possibly places to push this kind of thinking, probably not in this paper, but there seems to be a relationship between, and I had felt like in the past 10 years, the conversations had moved beyond antibacterial sterility as the kind of gold standard of health, and instead towards fostering actually a community of microbes in which we live, and becoming microbiome friendly creatures that instead of trying to get rid of all microbes, to foster healthy communities of microbes instead. So to kind of use one against the other, which is a very different view from the one that then became quite popular, which in COVID times, which like reasserted its predominance, which is we need to clean, quarantine, sterilize, and get rid of the virus, as opposed to find ways of working with our microbe friends. And it does fit in also to the kind of securitized notion of space. So ways to protect places, that the quarantine places need bigger, higher walls, more stringent border controls, to close borders between countries, to stay inside your house. So all of these kind of physical fortress mentality enclosures. And Antarctica is both, sterile and cut off from the rest of the world by this natural moat of the Southern Ocean. And so really, I think, is a place where those fantasies of being able to be completely sterile, cut off, and fortressed against the world, those fantasies really play out in science fiction as well as in political language. I'm not sure what exactly to do with that. That what we didn't want to advocate in the end is that, and if you've ever been to Antarctica on a tourist boat, which is how I went, they do feel like rituals of cleaning every little possible crevice of your jackets in case you've accidentally brought seeds onto, which might become an invasive species in Antarctica. But at the same time, there is a kind of performative ethic of attempting to keep the place free from invasive species and therefore protect the penguins. And so we don't want to say that all of those rituals and the intention behind them isn't important. It feels very important, but also ritualistic in a way that is also a little bit impossible, like empirically impossible. We haven't in the world been able to cut any place off very effectively.
What if you could say a little bit more about the going towards the commercial interests? I was struck as I was reading your piece about, kind of questions about development, questions about tourists' interests in Antarctica. The, I had recently read a piece by American Studies scholar, Indigenous scholar Nick Estes, who had written for The Guardian about an op-ed about sort of the profound privatization of global land bases. He's speaking specifically about, Bill Gates and talking about kind of what are some of the implications of the, and what might be the commercial interest there. But I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about, I think what you, just looking for the language here. I think what you called I think you referenced them as commercial interests. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, about what you're seeing and about what some of the sort of fear narratives seem to be bubbling to the surface about who and what belongs in Antarctica.
Yeah, I mean, this tourism stuff about Antarctica is fraught in ways that half the researchers have eventually, particularly the scientific researchers are just like, you can't understand the place unless you go there. And so all of the humanities scholars end up going by hook or by crook, and then feel like they're part of the problem. But, should we be advocating for a world park of no human involvement at all? Science activities have been exploding, and actually the continent is full of abandoned bases, because doing science in Antarctica gives you possible rights to claim territory if that becomes possible after the end of the Antarctic Treaty. So there's a lot of just science, kind of performative science bases that people hope to become, or countries which have very, very intermittent interest in the continent, because there isn't an obvious payoff at this point. But there's kind of like holding onto your options by doing science so that one day you might be able to make a territorial claim. So that's like one area of kind of quite strange, actually, human involvement in the continent. And the other one is that when I went to visit, it was, I think at the time, 3 years ago, there were 50,000 tourists a year, which is not a huge number if you compare to how many tourists go to Rome every year. But it's still, I think, a number that is often surprising to people, that how many are already going. And there've been amazing kind of ethnographies of Antarctic tourism. Anything from Jonathan Franzen has a great essay on this, on being, on like the kind of banality of being a tourist anywhere, or like being shuttled in queues to get your food or whatever while you're in Antarctica. So that disjuncture of some people have to, there's a whole army of people who just do room cleaning in Antarctica for most of the time. So that those kind of weird paradoxes, I think the privatization is the thing that is currently quite worrying, because all of these, you can only get to Antarctica by ship. The cruise liners that take tourists there are subject to the same lack of regulation of shipping in general, and cruise liners more specifically everywhere. They have banded together in the International Antarctic Tour Operators Association, IATO, to try and prevent regulation by self-policing, which is part of the basis for these rituals. But there's also, a mix of motivations there. It's also some people who are Antarctic tour operators that want to protect the Antarctic environment. And I think Antarctica is one of the most extreme, the obvious cases of, the kind of Raymond Williams, there's emergent discourses and current and past discourses that really meld in a way that is striking. So many of the tourism cruises are like walk in Shackleton's footsteps yourself. So, and it's completely live, heroic era narrative. And then there's this kind of decolonizing Antarctica discourse, which is also quite predominant. And they just don't necessarily, there's two kinds of conservation cruises. You can go on nature conservation and heritage conservation. And sometimes it's not obvious whether the interest of the conservation in the cruise is on conserving Shackleton's hut just as it was, or in, you know, penguin colonies. And those narratives can get quite, I mean, it's true everywhere. I'm just saying it's quite exaggerated in the case of Antarctica.
Thanks, Charne. Frederic, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. I was very interested by the contrast between the view of Antarctica as a protected continent against invasive species and viruses brought by scientists, and on the other side, the idea of defrosting by climate change and the possibility that some viruses would unmelt from the ice, and I was wondering if the second idea was more recent. You don't really date it in your review of the literature on Antarctica, and also since there was very little presence in Antarctica by contrast with the Arctic continent, the Arctic ocean in the north. I mean, how is it justified that some viruses would be defrosted if it's not from human presence in the past? So how are scientists led to imagine retrospectively that there was a human presence in the past that would lead to this melting of viruses?
Which is why often everyone runs into that problem, and if you're writing your pulp science fiction and then you're like, but it was aliens, you know, that's why I think that buried alien under the ice trope is so common, weirdly, in Antarctica, partly because it's hard to say, well, why would there have been a human presence here before? Although I must say, this is a total side note, but if you've looked up enough stuff, because Google is watching, about Antarctica for your research, I now get all Facebook advertising is about Antarctic conspiracy theories, which is about many things that are apparently buried under the ice in Antarctica. So, you know, they almost have to try and avoid the conspiracy theories. They're so prevalent about various buried things under the ice. I think that paradox that there is a shift in the 20th century, and other people have written about this, between the going from in the early 20th century, which is when most of the heroic era narratives of exploration, the Shackletons, etc., are in that period, and then it's really about how ferocious and dangerous the continent is to humans, and that you have to test your strength and your kind of human weaknesses against this implacable natural force. So it's just ice and cold and wind. I mean, those are all of the associations. And there's a point at which it shifts into actually the continent is mostly vulnerable to us. So we're the implacable force, and are destroying it quite rampantly. And that has, I mean, it has it can be dated on a number of in a number of ways, I guess, not unexpectedly. But one is the Antarctic Treaty System and the International Geophysical Year, 1958. It starts coming into effect, and there's the beginning of this realization that if it is a continent for science, it's also, you know, the human impact on the environment is becoming much more obvious even then. and so I don't think that's really a climate change question even back then, but just the question of waste, that scientific activities and exploration activities had already been leaving, whole areas of ice just brown and messy, and there's a lot of physical waste. So I mean, I think there's a particular interesting thing in that paradox, and I guess one of the ideas is that when something is described as particularly I think even from feminist scholarship, we're aware of the ways in which something can be both very vulnerable and very dangerous, and that those are kind of often two sides of the same construction. So I do think there was something about that shift that maybe isn't so unexpected, to go from being intensely, I mean, if you think of anything else that was threatening to humans, it's like the lions went from being like something that you had to hunt and test your mettle against, and were very dangerous to humans, to a threatened and endangered species very quickly. The one thing final point that I do just want to note, have I forgotten it? Oh yeah, that when people are doing ice core samples now, so basically snow packs a lot of air into it. If you drill through the ice, and this relates to the comparison between the Arctic and Antarctic. Because on the one hand, the Arctic has been melting much more obviously and quickly than Antarctica for a long time. And so you would think that the narratives of frozen and soon to be defrosting dangerous viruses would happen in the Arctic. But the Arctic, I mean, I think I didn't really know completely before I got into this, that you think of the North Pole and the South Pole as kind of somehow equivalent, but they're very, very different. There's no land at the North Pole. It's a tiny sea. The South Pole is a huge ocean. There's only the ice in the Arctic only gets to about 4 meters thick. The ice in the Antarctic is 4 kilometers thick, because it can be on top of the continent. So that notion of, the ice cores haven't gotten to the bottom of that ice yet. So there is still this sense of it's that last unexplored terrain still. But when they do, basically you get bubbles of air in the ice when you do these ice coring. One of the people we met there said, she used to do ice coring, and they would take the leftover ice and put it in their nightly whiskey, take really expensive whiskeys when they were camping by the ice core stations, and the sort of little bubbles of air from the Jurassic period would pop into their ice as their whiskey as the ice melted. But that's kind of where it comes from, that there might be a dinosaur virus, not so much a human presence, but that there actually is evidence of kind of ancient species of penguins that lived in Antarctica when it was tropical. And so that's the kind of virus that might be unleashed.
Thank you.
Going along with that theme of kind of what the ice reveals, I mean, there's so many media stories just in the last year of, I'm trying to kind of go from memory of some of the titles, but just, new microbe, found in melting ice, kind of, there was the ancient lion cub discovered, so this sort of idea about what ice reveals, and ice as water, not as static sort of land, really does sort of in many ways reiterate what we were talking about before we hit record today, about how global the narratives can be that you're grappling with, that this is, you were suggesting before that this is so particularly place-based and thinking about land as kind of in a static way, but thinking in terms of water, I think a lot, this is such a global narrative. And I wonder if you might say, talk a little bit about that segment in your piece where you talk about the suppression of histories of involvement in Antarctic exploration of peoples of color. This purity narrative, this contagion narrative, as sort of having a long history in these historic narratives of scientific racism, of kind of exclusionary scientific practices. But I wonder if you would just say a little bit more about this kind of suppression of histories, and talk a little bit more about these different kinds of erasures or attempts at erasure that you're seeing that really resonate in carrying forward work in Antarctica and about Antarctica.
Yeah, I wrote my colleague and I, who were working on this from the perspective of South Africa, wrote a kind of reflective essay, not such an academic piece, but trying to make sense of the experience. And we called it Reading in Antarctica, because, what do you do when you're there? There's a lot of just looking at marine mammals and a lot of reading. That's the kind of ship experience, which is apparently not unique to us at all. I mean, many of the early explorers would say, we needed books more than food, because there's like a mix of really intense trying to battle against the ice with your sled and also long periods of boredom. So, the dealing with both is the kind of co-construction of literature and that kind of space is very long historied. Part of what we talked about was that I think when you start reading these things, the general narrative. Shackleton goes and he explores, or Amundsen, Pips got to the post in reaching the South Pole first. I first read a book by absolute chance called, and it has the outrageous title, A Negro Explorer at the Pole. And it's about the North Pole exploration, and the first person to the North Pole has been canonized, and there's a bronze statue of the man, white New York Explorers Society, American explorers, as the first man to the pole. And then this is the autobiography of his African-American right-hand man who went ahead to the pole, found out where it was, and then got back and dragged the white explorer there on a sled, because, so then who is the first person to the pole? The one narrative isn't memorialized in the same way. And then there was this third layer where actually both the American explorers were kind of guided there by Inuit guides. So, there's like this kind of multi-layered, but you'll still learn on Wikipedia in the history books that Peary was the first to the North Pole. So that's what we kind of like the very like blindingly obvious point that sometimes the narratives of exclusion aren't actually that true. That the continent was never exclusive. Or it didn't successfully exclude many people. I still feel like even if you read Moby Dick now, and every time I do, I'm surprised at the multiracial global community that it portrays, so in some ways I think our sense of history is whiter and more exclusionary now than history was in fact, even in its kind of literary forms. One of the things that we want to add now, because I think the Arctic history has been much more decolonized already than Antarctic history because of narratives like this, that there's a much more obvious indigenous human presence. Recently, let me not get too sidetracked by the North Pole, but there was a paper published by New Zealand scholars, which actually does, for the first time, make a strong case for indigenous exploration from New Zealand and awareness of Antarctica much before, because there was still a sense that actually really it's so far away that no one had actually seen Antarctica before European ships were sufficiently fortified by steel hulls to get there. But there's the first kind of suggestion of indigenous engagement with Antarctica from Maori New Zealand exploration in a much earlier period. So I am always skeptical of the narrative that there was nothing, but it is hard to find ways of pushing back against that, particularly if we think about the 3 gateway cities or the 5 gateway cities to Antarctica. It's kind of a new formulation. Cape Town is one of them, and was used as a port, in very kind of practical terms, as a port to do a last refill of everything before many of the exploratory vessels went to Antarctica, particularly from Norway. Those ships may or may not have picked up crews that were from here. There were a lot of whaling crews. One of my postdocs is doing quite interesting research on whaling through the 20th century that continued and used people that are now fishermen on the west coast of South Africa. And so there's this kind of oral history of experience of the Southern Ocean, which doesn't feature in the traditional narratives of who was there. And I guess the problem is the counterfactual claims are actually hard to make, especially as these histories are being lost, particularly oral histories over time.
Thanks so much for that, Charne. Yeah, these there have been a number of interesting narratives in other parts of the world as well, using other kinds of archives and memory to document this, from archaeology and DNA to oral history. And so I think this is such a really interesting time to be writing, in the oceanic humanities about these sort of cross pollinations and questions about frontier and who is where when. And disrupting some of these sort of white only narratives. Melanie, you had posted something about an artist. I wonder if you wanted to say anything about Sasha.
Yeah, I mean, like I had exactly the same question that Rachel, you asked now. You had asked about what is the genealogy of these excluded people actually being present, and what are the possible archives. And then, I mean, it's just the artists. I posted a link to her website, Sasha Huber. She has this series of works of interventions in the Swiss Alps. I mean, different contexts, but also I think like what she deals with is this idea that Black people aren't present in white spaces, in like snowy spaces. So that might be interesting to look at.
Another one, sorry, Melanie,
yeah.
Before you continue, there's a similar lovely essay about even places like national parks in the US, so Yosemite. There's a new project about discovering totally forgotten histories of Black rangers in the parks. So there's these long histories of Black presence in national parks in the US, and there's no kind of cultural memory of this in, I guess, predominant hegemonic discourses. So that's just simply going to archives and looking at photographs. So there's a project by an actual ranger. The bringing up the alpine imaginaries is actually quite interesting, and I've been wondering how to link all of these things, but people just talk about it as the cryosphere. So all of these ice-ridden parts of the world, and so taking the 2 poles, but also Greenland and also high mountain terrain as this sphere of ice, and it's amazing the extent to which as much as you can read. I mean, I'd read a fantastic Australian scholar whose work on indigenous whalers and sealers from Australia. So indigenous Australians were involved in going to sub-Antarctic islands in the southern Indian Ocean, where they may or may not have met African sealers and whalers as well, who were taken on boats from Durban. These are possibly, Lance van Sittert has, a South African historian, has written extensively about Black presence on as crew, just totally elided and not mentioned in the narratives, but the Black crews on, for instance, the Operation Snooktown, which was the name of the expedition to go and claim Marion Island for South Africa as a proxy for Britain. So there's a lot of archaeology as well. So the archaeologists are discovering on many of the sub-Antarctic islands have been totally decimated of seals, penguins, for furs, being sold to China. The story is global from a very long time ago. And I guess those notions of exploration, that we need to go and explore these places, really came after a lot of exploitation had already taken place, but in fairly secret ways. Sorry, Melanie, you also had something else that you were going to say and I interrupted you.
Yeah, I mean, just the one point that I'm curious about is just the, like that framing of Antarctica as empty. But what about like the animals and the plants that are there? And from your experience of going there, like, I mean, if you think about how parks are framed in Africa, like the colonial idea of the park is also, they're framed as empty of people, but they're not. But there's this charismatic big animals, the elephants and the lions, and all of them. So does, like, do the penguins and the whales have a similar status, or is it framed as empty because the animals are so small, like, I don't know, they're not like visible to the eye, and the plants aren't spectacular either, but like plants are like not seen as much as animals in the first place. Could you say something about that? And then I was also just struck reading the paper about this ritual of watching the film, like that like the scientist's arrival to the place is through science fiction. But also like connecting that back to what you said about the reading, that it's so much about reading. So I'm wondering, like, is there like a shift from like reading as a pastime to watching films?
The interesting thing about watching films, to start there, is that it's a much more communal activity, whereas reading became briefly quite individual. In the days of early exploration, it was often communal as well. So everyone would read to one another in the very crowded confines of the hut. One of the funny things I found was that everyone is, which is in the reading and Antarctica piece, is that there's just so much in the journals and in the books of exploration. There's so much talk of food, that everyone thinks of Antarctica as this kind of place of manly exploration in the outside world, but a lot of it's about cooking and recipes, the people reading recipes aloud to one another because they were just longing for other kinds of food than eating penguin meat again. And so, I mean, there's quite interesting poems about this as well. The notion of the empty is actually very interesting, and it's not something I'm totally got to grips with yet conceptually. And I've been working on a project as well with some other people about how does Antarctica help us to think through questions of colonization and decolonialism? Because normally the myth of terra nullius is false. That's the kind of premise of post-colonial critique, is that Britons go to Australia and they say this is an empty land, this is terra nullius. It's not, in fact. It's just that we are classing, for instance, people as animals, or and or not seeing the actual animals and not thinking of them. And then, you know, Melanie always takes us this important third step, which is also what about the plants? In Antarctica, there's actually, it really pushes that basis of critique. And I think pushes us towards a view of colonialism less as domination-centric, but of domination as a real obfuscation of extraction, and kind of that domination is what you have to do in order to extract, but it's not necessarily the purpose of colonization. And I think that it makes it a lot easier to say, well, we're not doing colonialism now because we're not going out in order to dominate other people. But if you think of that as something that just was like a necessary evil in order to get at the goods, this is a very unformed thought, because we actually had a workshop on this earlier this year, and everyone really struggled to think through this notion of what do you do with an actually empty space. However, that has many caveats. One is that there are plants and animals in Antarctica. Everyone does say, I mean, the joke is that if you're a botanist, being a botanist, an Antarctic botanist is really easy because there are two kinds of plants. Like, it's really low on plant diversity. And they're both like microscopic mosses. So, you know, there really isn't a lot of plant material on the ice. So it's everything that if you think, and we go back to Rachel's point, is that if you think of, if your paradigms are land-centered and static, it means that you're thinking of the land first under the continent of Antarctica and the stable ice that's on top of it as the territory. But there's a kind of sleight of hand here, I think, because all of the creatures and all of the diversity and all of the kind of plant and animal life is actually in the sea that surrounds the continent. Even the bulk of the animals' lives that you see on land is actually takes place in the sea. So there's this real inversion of where all the liveliness and history and natural history is. It's all underneath the surface of the water rather than on the land nearby. So, you know, if you think we look at South African history, it's like the sea is negligible. It's a way of getting here. And then all the history, including natural history, is kind of on land. Whereas in Antarctica, that shift is quite, is very stark. You know, there really actually isn't a lot of life on top of the ice. And even, you know, you think of the continent as, oh, but it has penguins and whales and seals. Well, let's say everything that goes on top of the ice, penguins and seals, and seabirds. And all of those creatures are actually located, where if you go there as a tourist, there's like very few places where there's no ice. So it's where the land is steep, and so it hasn't been covered in ice. And so there are parts that have rocks, and rocks are gold there in Antarctica. And so the penguins give each other rocks as presents. But, you know, like these tiny patches of land are where all of the animals are, because actually things really struggle to live on ice except for the emperor penguins. So I find there's something really interesting about how to think through questions of colonization and extraction when everything that is being extracted can be hidden under the surface of the sea.
Just one remark on penguins. I was wondering if they became emblematic species of the Antarctica also because they are black and white. So there's also a visual politics of penguins because they're very visible on the ice. And if there had been any extraction project concerning penguins, like as was done with the dodo in terms of making meat out of them. I had also one other remark because it's coming to the end of the session, but I was interested by how Antarctica fits between two kinds of fields of research. So you talk about oceanic studies and the need to see it as a dynamic space and decolonize the view of the continent. But you also seem to be inscribed in cryopolitics. It's a term that has been coined by Emma Koval and Joanna Radin to talk about this, seeing spaces as freezers, where there's a whole politic of conserving and anticipating the unmelting, and so it seems that these two, it's at the border between literary studies and science studies.
The penguins are an interesting case and a really good, I mean, I know because everyone finds them adorable. Like they're just, I can't tell if they're inherently charismatic or if that's some kind of cultural construction, but nevertheless, cultural constructions are in fact very powerful. And so kind of everyone loves to talk about penguins. What is weird is the extent to which they were harvested just absolutely rapaciously for a long time. Penguin were just, people would be dropped on islands and said, harvest every penguin on this island. And they would just have with a big penguin boiling vat and just throwing penguins to burn them for oil. So penguin populations are absolutely devastated in the 19th century. And then oddly, whaling gave the penguins a real break. But, so the penguin whale populations were really devastated in the 20th century because it took us a long time as humans to get good at really effectively hunting whales. And it was totally nailed in the early 20th century. And I think because, it was still seen as something that was kind of adventurous and difficult to do, the whale populations were absolutely devastated. After a very, very heavy bludgeoning in the 19th century, like absolutely devastated in the 20th century, and they compete with penguins for krill. So penguin populations recovered actually while they weren't being harvested and whales were. So there's this, I think, fantastic paradox about whaling, and whaling is a really good way to think about Antarctica and oceans and mammals and kind of scalar conflicts, ways to think across scale. Rebecca Giggs has a beautiful book of essays on this topic, and she talks about you can congratulate yourself as humans for stopping hunting the whales. The anti-whaling movement did that, but now we're just poisoning their environment, so all the whales are dying anyway. And there's something about similar happening with the whole continent of Antarctica, where everyone's saying, well, we're not using it to dispose of nuclear waste now, so go us, but we're just slowly melting it by ignoring it. So there's like a shift from, I think, fast to slow violence, but also kind of massive environmental damage as collateral. But you're right about the cryopolitics, like how much is this collateral or how much is it actually this sense of we're freezing our assets, freezing our options to possibly use the Northern Passage as a shipping route as soon as the ice melts. So there's a lot of kind of financial investment in the possibilities of a melted future that are quite sinister, I think. Yeah, I mean, the cryo ecologies and cryopolitics are possibly, they're very out of sight, out of mind, but perhaps not for much longer.
Possibilities of a melted future. I love that that phrase, Charne, even as it is shocking and disturbing. I want to say thank you for sharing this co-authored piece, The Only Almost Germ-Free Continent Left. This has been a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for bringing questions about purity and contagion and sterility and viruses to us through the lens of Antarctica. And thanks again to Melanie for helping us to organize this session. So next week, I just want to say that we're going to have Charlotte Brivet. I think maybe I'm mispronouncing her name. We haven't had a chance to speak face-to-face yet, but she is a medical anthropologist and STS specialist who is going to help us think through the relationships between viruses and their hosts, and talk to us a little bit more about this question of the war against viruses and complicate that next week at 4 p.m. CET, 7 a.m. LA time. So thanks again, everybody. And so good to meet you, Charne, and get a chance to talk about this new work.
Thank you all for really great provocations to think through. You know, while I'm answering them, I'm also taking them on board.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
I'll see you next
Thank
time.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.